We know that in chapter 7, Haman was hung. Well, not hung, but he was staked. And that was the end of...
Did we go through the thing where he walked around the streets with him in a car?
Not yet. No, you're talking about Mordecai? You're talking about Mordecai when he was walking around?
No.
Oh, yeah, that was 2 chapters ago. You're a little behind. So in chapter 8, after he was killed, executed, we'll start off with Esther 8, verses 1 and 2. On that day did the king Ahasuerus give the house of Haman the Jews' enemy unto Esther the queen. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was unto her. And the king took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it unto Mordecai, and Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. So, in other words, what happened here was that after his death, the king said, well, whatever was his is yours. That means all his servants, his property, his possessions, all of that stuff now is going to go to Mordecai. And he gets to have it and have rule over it and do with it what he sees fit. And we're going to see in next week in chapter 9 what he does with some of it. So, everything that Haman actually worked for went to his enemy. It went to Mordecai. And so I think that shows a little bit of God's, I call it God's sense of humor, because, this guy thinks that he's doing, to build up stuff for himself, and then at the end, everything that he built up was given to his enemy, which was, of course, in this case, the good guy. And he left nothing to pass on to the family, because everything then went to Mordecai. So then we see that he had taken off his ring, and which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. So now we see again the king is doing the same type of thing that he did before. And by the way, I one of the things that I was doing today was I was researching a little bit of how common was it for the king to give up his signet ring. And what I found between last week and this week is that there was more than one. There were certain signet rings, that you would stamp onto a seal, and they would mean certain things. So some of them were for a decree by the king. Some were for the just the regular administration. Some were probably for collecting taxes, and some were probably for legal matters and things like that. So, but the one that he had that he gave to Haman seemed to be the master ring. That was the ring, boy. When you saw that seal from the king, that was a king's decree. So that was a big one. And he seemed to pass this around. Now, I looked up to see, was it common to pass around like the one signet ring? And I didn't really find much on it, but it was uncommon for the king to be completely detached from what was going on and what it was used for. Now, he's not going to sit there and stamp. There was 127 providences, right? So he's not going to sit there and stamp, each one. He might take the ring off and say, here, you stamp them, And I believe it was in some type of wax impression that they put on this stuff, and then the ring would seal it, and it would make an impression. Because what's that?
Yeah, they've done that for years.
Yeah, and what they're finding today is during these archaeological digs in Jerusalem is they're finding these impressions that were made, and they've been preserved for all times, and they're finding out that different decrees that were given by different people and usually had the king's name on it. Now, Ahasuerus, remember there were 3 of them, so they had to determine which one was which. But so it was a little bit uncommon for him to say, go ahead and write your own decree. Now, we're going to see more of that as we go along here. But he gave it to Mordecai, and he said to him, took off his ring, which he gave, taken from Haman, gave it to Mordecai, and Esther sent Mordecai over the house. So he gave it to him because remember, Esther had gone in and said, this evil Haman, but that's where she left it. He was going to kill all of my people. There wasn't actually a solution given in chapter 7. It was just, and of course he was really upset, the king. He's like, wait a minute, did I do that? And so here's what I wrote. So it was slightly more common to give certain favored officials the signet ring for carrying out administrative duties, but not so much so that he wouldn't know what he was giving the ring out for. But we're going to find out, or actually we found out last week, that when the king found out that this was to have all the Jews killed, that he was upset. He was really upset. Remember, he went out into the garden and he was fuming. Well, why would he be fuming if he signed the decree? Because he had no idea. Because he gave it to Haman and said, do what's right. Here, take the ring and do what you find, is right. And by these people who are, supposedly not abiding by my laws. He just thought it might have been a small group of people. No idea. So apparently now he's doing the same thing with with Mordecai. They weren't the things that he was doing. He said, here, take the ring and see what you want to do with it. These things weren't administrative in nature, but were laws dealing with the killing of people throughout the empire. So in my opinion, the king was detached from the more important issues the ring was being used for. The sloppy leadership might have been a contributing factor in his eventual death a few years later. I did find out he lived about 13 years beyond this, and then he was executed. And I think his kingdom was overthrown. So then we move on to Esther 8 and verses 3 through 6. Now here's where Esther has to make another plea. And it says, and Esther spake yet again before the king, and fell down at his feet, and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite, and his devices that he had devised against the Jews. Then the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So she's batting 1,000 right now. Every time she sees the king, he's so happy to see her that he holds out the golden scepter. And I thought that was great. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, if it please the king, and if I have found favor in thy sight, and the thing seems right before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews which are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see evil that shall come unto my people, or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? So, she went to him and she was crying, and apparently, like Anthony said, he doesn't like to see his wife suffering, and I don't like to see my wife suffering. Well, he didn't want to see his wife suffering. He goes, well, what can I do to help you? Now remember, the laws of the Medes and the Persians, you can't undo a law that was done. So they had to come up with some way of also eradicating the law. Now here's some things that I was able to find out. First of all, I was under the mistaken impression that once the letters went out, beginning on a certain day, the killing would start and they didn't have to stop until it was all over with. But that's not what happened here. What happened here was one day was assigned to kill all the Jews. Okay? That's why Purim is one day. Okay? So the day was assigned, and it was the 13th of the month of Adar, I think was the name of the month. And they were supposed to, the bad guys were supposed to go out and kill all the Jews. So, but let's go back for a second here. So she asked that the decree be revoked, but it can't be revoked. So in this instance, she approached the king, and the king could have had her killed, but he didn't, again. And let that be a lesson that you should always look pleasing when you go outside, because you never know when someone's going to hold out the golden scepter and say, you were pleasing in my sight. Whereas you go out looking less than good, somebody might say, be gone from me. Just a little side note about the book of Esther. So yeah, he didn't like seeing her in tears, but he did allow, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, not revoke, to make another decree. That's what it was, right? And she made the request. Hold on, I think I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, yeah. So they wanted to make a counter decree. They can't undo what was done. Okay, the decree is that all the Jews are going to be killed, and but we can make another decree that allows them to protect themselves on the day they were scheduled for annihilation. So we'll read about that in Esther 8, 7 through 14. And here's how that went. Then the king Ahasuerus said unto Esther the queen, and to Mordecai the Jew, Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and him they have hanged on the gallows, because he laid his hand upon the Jews. Write ye also for the Jews, as it liketh you, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring, for the writing which is written in the king's name, and sealed with the king's ring, may no man reverse. Then were the king's scribes called at the time in the 3rd month, that is the month of Sivan, and the 23 day thereof, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded unto the Jews, and to the lieutenants, and the deputies, and the rulers of the provinces which are from India unto Ethiopia, 127 provinces, unto every province according to the writing thereof, and unto every people after their language, and to the Jews according to their writing and according to their language. And he wrote in the king Ahasuerus' name, and sealed it with the king's ring, and sent letters by post on horseback, and riders on mules, camels, and young dromedaries. Didn't look that one up. Wherein the king...
Camels?
What's that?
Is that camels?
No, because they said camel.
Oh.
I have to look that one up. Where the king granted the Jews, which were in every city, to gather themselves together, and to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish all the power of the people and providence that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take the spoil of them for a prey, upon one day, in all the providences of King Ahasuerus, namely upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. The copy of this writing for a commandment to be given in every province was published unto all the people, that the Jews should be ready against that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. So the posts that rode upon mules and camels went out, being hastened and pressed on by the king's commandment, and the decree was given at Shushan the palace. So we see there that the counter decree was you can stand up for yourself and you can fight. So that got me thinking, what kind of society was it that would have said, when a decree comes down, did it say, if you want to kill the Jews, you can, or must you? So I looked into it a little bit deeper, and it was a decree that said you must kill and annihilate every single Jewish person. Okay? So the decree was quite extensive, and it was given to everybody, and it makes it very clear. You notice that in the last couple of verses from number 11 all the way through 14, it's talking about how far and wide it was spread, because they wanted to make sure that even though the original decree went out to every person, that if you actually do this and try and kill the Jews, they're going to kill you first. Now, apparently they had about 3 months to get this thing together, to get this all out there, and then for the Jews to be able to arm themselves. But I think God's hand was with it too, because it wasn't like, first of all, there's no reference of any Jew being killed, but we'll see in chapter 9, there is a reference of 75,000 of the bad guys being wiped out. Okay, so it seemed a little bit one-sided. So they were given a decree to go against their attackers. They were able to defend themselves, and they were able to take the spoils from those people that they defeated. But we're going to see that they did not take the spoils from anybody. That they killed those people who came after them, and I believe that the reason there was 75,000 killed was because the 75,000 were the ones that came after them. Now, there were probably millions of people in all of those provinces, and I think most of the people were like, yeah, I'm not going to go out and fight them. I heard they have God with them. I heard that God, Jehovah, can be pretty mean against the enemies, so I think I'm going to stay home today. And the decree was only for one day, remember? So they didn't have to worry about it. They just had a 24-hour span of time to deal with it. And then some of the other writers, they make some correlations that I didn't think will really even fit. But so I came up with my own things, which I do see that they fit. We see again the king didn't write the decree, right? But said, write that you see fit to write, and the words he used, as it liketh you, in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring. The king didn't learn a thing, okay? He didn't learn anything from what he did with Haman, and he trusted Haman, and then of course he had to stake him. But now he's doing the same thing, because remember, Mordecai, which I guess he would be considered the prime minister at this point, at least that's what I've been reading, that Haman was the prime minister. And now Mordecai's the prime minister. So he said, well, I can trust you, right? Here's the ring. So unfortunately, he didn't learn a thing. And most likely the same thing he did with Haman, take my ring, write whatever you want.
How the heck did he get power?
What's that?
The king himself, because he's so stupid.
Yeah. Well, so as I looked through this to try and see what kind of king he was, there was a lot of bad things written about him. He was stupid. He did a lot of really dumb things.
How did he get power? You don't just...
He probably had loyal people behind him, which, you rose to power back in those times by killing the people that were in power. Kind of like the same way it happens in third world countries today, or, socialist or communist countries. Why is Putin still in power? Because nobody's rose up against him to kill him. But if they do, then there'll be a new leader in Russia. So, one thing that I found is interesting to note that it never stated how many of the non-Jews really wanted to kill the Jews. There doesn't seem to be any real hatred. And when you look at the timeline, this was during the timeline of some of the minor prophets around 460 BC. There was a lot going on. There was some hatred of the Jews back then, but it didn't seem like there was. Everybody seemed to get along, almost like in Iran before the Ayatollahs took over. Everybody got along. The Christians, the Jews, the Persians, they all got along. So it doesn't say, were there a lot of people who wanted to spare the lives of the Jews and didn't want to be involved in this? I would venture to say yes, there were, although there is no reference from the scripture, and not a lot of reference from, any of the scholars that had anything to say about it. What was noteworthy is that the Jews, when they did go out and do what they were going to do, they did not take any of the spoils. Okay? So when Haman was going to kill the Jews for money, the Jews were going to defend themselves, and they were going to do it for free. They didn't feel that it was their place to take the spoils. Now, I don't know what happened to them, to the spoils, but they got left there. So I would think that there would have been some sense of morality in that society, somewhere perhaps, but fortunately, since the decree was only for one day, they only had to endure this proclamation from the king for one day. So here's what I found a little bit about King Ahasuerus. And I don't know who wrote this because it didn't say. I probably could have looked on the site that I got it from. When Haman discussed the Jewish genocide with Ahasuerus, he does so in deliberately veiled language in Esther 3:8. And the king makes very few inquiries about the details, but leaves it all to Haman. Haman, by giving him free rein, even providing the royal signet ring in verse 10, it was Haman who organized and composed the royal decree, dispatched something that was only possible in ignorance of the king. I don't believe the king knew exactly what he was doing. I think the king thought it was a couple of people that were acting up, and I need some letters so I can go kill these people that are acting up. No clue that it was the entire Jewish population. Haman possessed the royal signet ring to authorize such dispatches. It's clear that at least in this instance, the king was little interested in the details of government and delegated it to Haman. It's funny. because history came all the way around and repeated itself over the last 4 years, didn't it? You know, we have somebody that was completely detached from government, had no idea what was going on. Just as a side note, it should also be recalled that neither Haman nor the king were aware that Esther was Jewish. Equally, the king was ignorant that Mordecai was a Jew, although Haman knew that he was. All right? So, and he kept that fact from him too. There's never a reference to Mordecai letting the king know that he was a Jew until Esther said it.
What was the problem?
Because they didn't want to reveal themselves until the appropriate time. I don't think they were the most popular people around. Remember, the reason that the Jews were there is because they were taken captive. But it's been years. They've been in captivity for so many years. They've integrated into society, and they weren't a problem. The beginning of the book of Esther makes it very clear that the Jews never did anything. They never acted up. They never rebelled. They never, the biggest thing amongst the Jewish people, which goes on even to today, all through the world, is, boy, I wish we could go back to our homeland. That's all they ever said. We don't want to kill anybody. Anytime you hear any type of news report where the Jews are the aggressor, they're lying. Okay? I can tell you that unequivocally, the Jews don't want to kill anybody, of course, unless they're attacked, but they just want to be left alone. They want to go back to their homeland. They want to go back to Jerusalem. That's part of their thought process, is if we could just get to Jerusalem. Unfortunately, that's the wrong Jerusalem. The one that they need to get to is the Jerusalem where the Savior came from and was crucified, but they're not getting that, and we'll see a little bit of some of that ignorance in a minute. So, had he been aware, it's almost certain that he would have prevented them from his plan from being hatched. And this is confirmed by the king's action, Esther 7. When the king discovered what had happened, he was ticked, and he then had Haman executed. So I think that there's enough in the background of Scripture, in the book of Esther, to see that the king was completely unaware that this plan involved all of the Jews. Because why would he run out into the
Well, he
garden?
got duped, and he knew it was his.
Oh, he got duped.
He knew it was his stupidity.
And that's why, yep, and I think that's when he ran out into the garden. He's like, oh, I can't believe I got duped by this guy. And he probably came in and said, I trusted you. Take him out. Ice him. So, now, here's the unfortunate part. It's unfortunate today that Jewish scholars mostly see the book of Esther as hyperbole and not a true historical book. And I've been reading a lot about what people write about the book of Esther, and a lot, probably more than half, of Jewish scholars today do not think this book was an actual historical account of what happened. That this was a story that somebody embellished to try and show people that there are certain things of, whatever. We know different. We know that God would not have put a storybook of the book of Esther into the Word of God had it not been true. If the book wasn't true, I think it would have started off by saying, a long ago in a faraway place, once upon a time, or something along those lines. But it didn't say that, all right? And we know that all of the characters that appear in this story are all appeared in history as well, okay? And it's well documented that they appear in history. But they have some of this converting things to hyperbole, because if some of the things that are written are exactly what they say, then the Jews are in trouble today. And that's part of the problem. So that's the sad lesson that I get from reading of what the Jewish scholars have to say about this book. Now, Dave, you asked about, this wasn't it. It was last week where they rode on the royal horse where he had to, 2 weeks ago, where he had to go parade him around. Yeah. Haman. Well, in this next section here, the couriers rode on royal horses, went out and hastened and pressed on by the king's command. So there was an urgency to get the word out. So they went in every mode of transportation.
And this was before he knew about Haman.
No, this is after Haman's dead. Yeah, we're well beyond that. So, and somebody did make a similarity here about a decree, urgent decree that God has made, and that is for us to get saved, right? And I think that that is a good correlation. That bids well with what's going on here. So now the last three verses are Esther 8, 15, 16, and 17. And Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel, blue and white, and with a great crown of gold, and with a garment of fine linen and purple, and the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. This is when they parade him around as the prime minister. I don't know if that's what you were talking about.
But didn't he, before that, a couple chapters back, he had the parade.
That was when he
Mordecai around, what's his face?
That's when Haman had to parade Mordecai around, right? This is now he's being set up. Here's your new prime minister. So take a look at this guy, and he's all dressed in the apparel. But the Jews loved him as well because he was the one who helped in the sparing of the Jews from destruction. And the guy who was going to be the first to go, which was Mordecai, was now the guy in charge of everything. So I thought that was great. Verse 16, the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in verse 17, and in every province and in every city, wheresoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And many of the people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them. So it's funny that a lot of times that one of the greatest passages is the last verse and the last sentence of a chapter. And here they converted. They converted to Judaism. Why do you think they did that? They did it because they saw the power of the God that they served. Now, even though God isn't mentioned and there's no mention of Jehovah, Mordecai was Jewish and Esther was Jewish, and Mordecai was a learned, proud Jew. He knew a lot. And in his position as prime minister, he was actually able to get that word out. And in a mixed community where there's the Persians and there's the Jews. The Christians weren't around back then, and then you had, actually there was no Islam back then either. So really you just had all the false religions like Balaam and all of those type of things. But everybody wanted to convert. Everybody wanted to be a Jew. Now, when you take a look at today, one of their most festive holidays is Purim. And that's what this celebrates. This celebrates the saving of the Jews by kind of one man, and Mordecai. I don't want to diminish the point that Esther played, especially considering the book is named after her, but Mordecai was the one who planned everything. He was the one who told her when to go and when to keep quiet, don't reveal that you're Jewish and whatever. He was also there when they had the beauty contest, right? And they said, the king's looking for a new wife. I think you should sign up for that. And she was probably like, why me? I don't think that's something I should be doing. But he got it all set up. He was the one who made sure that everything was always right. Then we see that he had a higher position in the palace, at least maybe a doorkeeper, because he was always in the right place at the right time. He had free reign to roam around, right? Because it's never said like, why is he here or whatever. Almost like Haman, right? Haman seemed to always be in the right place at the right time, but he had nefarious things going on. He was in the right place at the right time because he was always watching his back. He was always afraid someone was going to try and kill him. And he never realized that what came around full circle and got him in the end. And so...
I met people like that. I know people like that.
Yeah, I know.
I know somebody like that.
Yeah. A lot of people, they'll plan.
Looking over there.
Yep. They'll plan evil, and then they're always looking to see who's planning evil against them. And but anyway, as I read through that and got to verse 17, and it said, and the fear of the Jews fell upon them, and many of the people of the land became Jews. So, the one of the correlations that we can look at is, there are two reasons why you would get saved today. And one of them is because you fear God. And you fear that there's going to be a punishment for your sins someday. And in some people's lives, like those people that are in Iran today, that meeting of your maker could happen at any time. You could just walk out of your house and boom, bullet to the head, and that's the end of it. So, we don't know when the end's going to come and we're going to have to meet our maker. So we have to be very, very careful that we're serving God. If we're not going to do it out of love, then we need to make sure we do it out of fear. Okay? Now, God is a God of love, and He loves us like we're His children, because we are. But even a father who has children will get angry at his children every once in a while, right? And sometimes the kids are misbehaving, and God looks at us the same way. And sometimes we're misbehaving. But this verse kind of says it all, because it says they had the fear. They had this fear. And at this point in time, they were able to talk to those people, the Jews were, and be able to say, here's who we serve, and here's what God has done for us. Remember, the Jews are very big into history. And so they would say, oh, you want to hear how we got started? And it was Joseph was taken, one of Jacob's sons was taken. His brothers tried to sell him into slavery. They ended up in Egypt, and then they became this rich, large group of people. And then God miraculously did these things for us and led us through the desert by a pillar of fire at night. And He opened the sea, and we walked through it on dry ground. And these people are probably sitting there with their jaws open, like, really? You have a God that does that? And it's just really unfortunate that today, that the Jews look at that and they see the things that God did in the past, but the one thing that God did for mankind as a whole, which was die on the cross for us and be crucified, which is spelled out over and over and over again in the Old Testament, that God was going to send the ultimate sacrifice, and it was going to be His Son, that they just reject that. So they can believe that maybe they believe it. Maybe they look at that as hyperbole too. The sea opened and they walked through on dry ground. Well, what that really meant was, I don't know. I haven't looked at that part of it, but I noticed that on a lot of other things that they do, they look at it as hyperbole. If it's too hard for them to understand, and I'm talking about the learned, the rabbis of the day, which were the same rabbis, by the way, that were in Jesus' time, when Jesus confounded them, right, with his teachings and His sayings, and they were like scratching their head. How did this 12-year-old kid learn so much? Where did he come from? So we can see that they miss the bigger picture, but do they get the smaller picture? I don't know. Sometimes it's disheartening that those are the people that are my ancestors, yet they can't see it. But I also get disheartened when I see people who hear the truth of something going on in the world, and they think it's something else. So mankind has not changed from the beginning of time till today, and it won't change until Jesus comes back and we're with Him in glory.
As Ecclesiastes says, there's nothing new under the sun.
That's true. Yep. Anybody have any questions? We got 2 chapters left. We probably won't get through chapter 9 in 1 week because it's actually long. This one was a pretty short. 7 and 8 were pretty short chapters, but we got a couple of weeks left and we'll be done with this book. Any questions? No? All right, let me close in a word of prayer.